Let's walk through our answers for our practice quiz for quiz number 4. So number 1 says, evidently, his periodic blindness is not uncommon news if you consider how Mr. Doherty washes his contact lenses in bleach. Well, a couple things I'm going to notice here is I'm testing on whether you pick up on the idea that evidently is one of those weird adverbs which always take a comma. It's kind of making a comment about the whole sentence. Remember, it's not an adverb like saying angrily or happily or helplessly. It's not describing the verb. It's making a comment about the whole sentence. The whole sentence is evident, so therefore it should take a comma. Another thing I'm testing you on is whether you can pick up on this double negative, which is on purpose, not uncommon. And you're allowed to do that with a word not and a prefix of uncommon. And lastly, just goes right into this clause and doesn't need a comma at all. It's not uncommon. And like, what is not uncommon news? This whole thing. All right. So A was my answer. Number 2, Mariah eventually broke up with Mitchell because she could only tolerate his addiction to Marvel movies for so long. Well, 2 things I'm testing you on this one is the idea that we're never going to put a comma near the word because, and also that word only should be a trigger word to realize it's not that she could only tolerate, but she could tolerate for only so long. So therefore C is our answer. Number 3, to eat, the hobo rummaged through the dumpsters at the park's pavilion to find some cake and homemade mayonnaise from the Rumspringa party. Well, in this case, we have an opening infinitive, which is to eat. And as long as it's an adverbial infinitive, it always gets the comma, no matter how long or short it is. Plus, you could also misread it as to eat the hobo, and no one wants to eat a hobo. So it should say to eat, comma, and then go on from there. And then there's another infinitive later in the sentence. Once again, those infinitives later in the sentence, they don't take commas. Check out number 4. Even though Andrew had been told not heat his cup of noodles over the Bunsen burner, the temptation was too much for him to ignore. Well, in this case, I open up with an infinitive or adverb clause, sorry about that, with even though. And any adverb clause which begins the sentence always takes a comma. And any form of though always takes a comma too. So it says, even though Andrew had been told to not heat his cup of noodles over the Bunsen burner, comma, that makes sense. The other thing I notice is I'm also splitting this infinitive to not heat. So as I look at my answers, C and D give it as not to heat. And I like that. But you'll notice on D, the comma's got kind of weird on me. So it's got to be C. Look at number 5, speaking of split infinitives. To barely edge, you can't say to barely edge. Let's say barely to edge or to edge barely. So it's got to be either C or D, just from the beginning. So to barely edge her grade to a 60% in Mr. Sterner's anatomy and physiology class, it was critical. Well, if you notice on this one, not only do I have to say to edge her grade barely, but I also want to make sure that the infinitive works with the subject. And right now, the original subject is the word it. So if I choose D, that gets Victoria to be the subject, and that's a much better choice. To the back page. With the end of the marking period just around the corner, Abby worried that Mr. Doherty wouldn't accept her bribe of Little Debbie Nutty wafers. Well, this is a string of prepositional phrases, so I wait to the very last one to put my comma in, with the end of the marking period just around the corner, comma. And there's never a comma near the word that. Number 7. Clearly, in order to avoid the quiz tomorrow, Josh's sudden case of malaria was a total lie. Well, once again, clearly is one of those weird adverbs which should always take the comma. So clearly, comma, it's making a comment about the whole sentence. But here's another thing. You have this infinitive which says, in order to avoid the quiz tomorrow. But the subject is not Josh. In the original sentence, it's Case. And his case isn't avoiding the quiz. Josh is. So if I look at my choices, I got to figure out which one actually would make sense. If you notice on the B choice, it still says sudden case of malaria with that infinitive. And the C choice is just moving the infinitive to the back, but you didn't change the subject. D is the only one that actually changes things around a little bit and saying, clearly, his sudden case of malaria was a total lie in order for Josh to avoid, and that makes more sense. Number 8, Sabrina couldn't scarcely finish eating the pasta dish that Tegan had made for Valentine's Day, mostly because it tasted like vomit. Well, in this case, couldn't scarcely is a double negative, so I've got to avoid that. So I can see B says could scarcely, C says couldn't finish, and then D still has couldn't scarcely. So it's got to either be B or C. When I continue reading this one, I realize then that I have at the very end of this thing, this mostly with a comma and mostly without the comma. Well, it kind of goes right into that clause, the word because. So even though the word mostly is there, the word because is what's really building this clause. And I never have a comma near that word because. got to be C. Number 9, because you hate reading is probably not a good reason to take this stupid class because you have to really like grammar to make it to June. In this case, I used the word because twice, and we've talked about this before about adverb clauses and noun clauses. The word because can start an adverb clause, and sometimes it can start a noun clause. What's really happening here is the first clause, because you hate reading, is a noun clause. That's the subject of the verb is. So if I say, what's the subject of the verb is, or if I said, what is probably not a good reason, you'd say, well, because you hate reading. That's the subject. So I don't want to put a comma between reading and is. But later in the sentence, I have is not a good reason to take the stupid class because you have to really like grammar to make it to June. That's an adverb clause. It tells us why it's not a good reason. So therefore, an adverb clause shouldn't have a comma when it's at the end of the sentence. So therefore, D is my answer. No commas anywhere. And lastly, number 10, haphazardly, Madison bubbled in her SAT with crayon because she easily knew that she could get into Craptown University on a Norwegian woodstacking scholarship. Well, once again, I know there's no comma near the word because, and that's why D's wrong. And this is a haphazardly, which kind of describes how she bubbled. It's not the whole sentence is haphazard, but it tells us how she kind of very quickly bubbled in her SAT. So there's no comma after haphazardly. It's just an adverb describing the verb. So it's got to be either B or C. And then I realized, oh, you've moved that word easily. It's not that she easily knew, but she knew that she could easily get into Craptown University. The answer has got to be C.